The galactic empire of Calthrix stretched across 10,000 star systems. And at its heart lay a truth that every citizen knew from birth. Strength was everything. Dragons ruled the skies of 100 worlds, not as beasts, but as partners to the greatest warriors humanity had ever produced. And these were not the dragons of ancient Earth mythology, but something far more terrifying. For they were bioengineered weapons from a war so old that no one remembered who had created them or why. They were massive creatures of scales and fire, an impossible intelligence, capable of surviving in the vacuum of space, capable of burning through starship hulls with a single breath, capable of living for thousands upon thousands of years, and they chose their riders through a bond that no scientist had ever fully understood. The neural link between dragon and rider was sacred, a connection so deep that thoughts and emotions flowed between them like water. And once formed, it could never be broken except by death. For 3,000 years, the dragons had chosen only the strongest candidates, warriors who could match their ferocity, generals who could command armies, psionic elites whose mental powers rivaled the dragons themselves. So when the conscription camps of Velith Prime received word that Velkor, the Undying, was descending from orbit, every soldier stood at attention, and every commander held their breath in anticipation. Velkor was legend. His scales had turned to living obsidian over the millennia, black as the void between stars and harder than any metal known to science. And his eyes burned with the accumulated wisdom and power of 10,000 years of existence. He had refused every candidate for 800 years, watching them parade before him and finding each one lacking. And the Empire had begun to wonder if he would ever choose again. The camp commander, a decorated veteran named Cress, had assembled his finest warriors for the occasion. Men and women who had survived impossible battles and emerged victorious. Soldiers whose bodies had been enhanced with the latest military technology. They stood in perfect formation as goals. Valkor's shadow fell across the parade ground, his wings blotting out the sun as he descended with terrible grace. But the ancient dragon did not even glance at them. Instead, his massive head turned toward the medical tents at the edge of the camp, where the wounded and the dying were kept, where those who had failed the Empire's standards waited for transport, back to whatever forgotten worlds had spawned them. Cress felt his heart sink as Velkor moved past his perfect soldiers without a word. In the medical tent, a young man named Emrys Vane was changing bandages on a soldier who had lost both legs in a training accident. And Emrys worked with gentle hands despite the crude prosthetic that replaced his own left arm, a cheap model that whirred and clicked with every movement. He had been medtech on a backwater colony called Sareth 7, before a genetic plague had swept through the population and killed everyone he had ever known. Everyone except 17 children that he had somehow managed to save. The plague had ravaged his body as well, leaving him with permanent nerve damage and muscles that would never fully recover. And the Empire had no use for a crippled healer when there were strong soldiers to train. He was waiting for transport home. Wherever home was supposed to be now, the shadow fell across him, and Emrys looked up to find an eye, the size of his entire body, staring down at him. An eye that burned with ancient fire and contained depths of intelligence that made him feel very small and very fragile. "You are the one from Sareth 7. The dragon's voice rumbled directly into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely, and Emrys nearly dropped the bandages in shock. "I am," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what happened there." Emrys swallowed hard and forced himself to meet that burning gaze, even though every instinct screamed at him to look away and bow and beg for mercy. "The plague came fast," he said, "and by the time we realized what was happening, half the colony was already dead. And I was a medtech, so I tried to synthesize a cure, but I failed. I failed over and over again while people died around me." He paused, and his prosthetic hand clenched into a fist. but there were children in the shelter. 17 of them, and their parents were dead, and there was no one else left. So I carried them to the emergency shuttle one by one, even though my legs were giving out, and my arm had already gone numb from the plague. You were dying, Velcor said. And it was not a question. Yes, but they were children. And they deserved a chance, even if I did not have one. Emrys remembered the weight of those small bodies in his arms, remembered the burning in his lungs and the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision, remembered transmitting their medical data to the rescue ships with fingers that could barely move. I did not expect to survive, he admitted. But somehow I did, and now here I am, useless to the Empire but alive. The dragon was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made the air itself tremble. For 800 years I have watched the Empire's finest warriors parade before me, and I have found them all lacking, for they sought power for its own sake. They craved strength so that others would fear them. They wanted the bond so that they could conquer and destroy. Velcor lowered his massive head until his eye was level with Emrys. But you crawled through the ruins of your world not to save yourself, but to save children who could offer you nothing in return. And when your body failed, you kept going anyway, because giving up was simply not something you could do. I am not strong, Emrys said, and his voice cracked with emotion. I am broken and weak, and I cannot even lift a pulse rifle anymore. You misunderstand strength, the dragon replied. For I have seen warriors who could shatter mountains crumble when faced with true adversity. And I have seen generals who commanded millions flee when their own lives were threatened. The ancient fire in Velcor's eyes seemed to burn brighter. But you, Emrys Vane, you understand something that they never will. That strength without something worth protecting is meaningless. That power without purpose is hollow. That the truest measure of a soul is not what it can destroy, but what it will sacrifice everything to save. The bond formed in an instant, searing itself into Emrys's mind like lightning made of pure connection. And suddenly, he could feel Velcor's presence inside his thoughts. Vast and ancient and overwhelmingly powerful, but also warm, also welcoming, also proud across the camp. Commander Kress watched in stunned disbelief as the most powerful dragon in the Empire bonded with a crippled healer. And he knew that when word reached the Imperial Court, there would be outrage. The Empire valued strength above all else. And they had just witnessed their greatest weapon choose the weakest candidate imaginable. They had no idea that this moment would change everything. They had no idea that the weak human kneeling before an ancient dragon would one day reshape the very foundations of their civilization. And they certainly had no idea that Velcor had been waiting 800 years for exactly this. A human who understood that true strength was not about power, it was about protection. 1 year had passed since the bonding, and the Imperial Court had not stopped seething with fury. Every tradition said that a dragon rider should command armies, should lead conquests, should expand the glory of the Empire through fire and force. But Emrys Vane had refused every military appointment they offered him. He had done something unprecedented instead, using the authority that came with being bonded to Velcor beyond dying, an authority that even the Emperor himself could not easily dismiss. Emrys had established something he called the Vane Sanctuary. It was a network of stations positioned along the Empire's most dangerous borders. Places where raiders attacked and slavers hunted and plagues spread unchecked. Places that the Empire had written off as not worth protecting. The first station was built on an asteroid in the Kethrani Belt, a region so lawless that even military patrols avoided it. And when Emrys arrived with Velcor at his side, the criminals who had made the belt their home fled in terror. An ancient dragon was not something anyone wanted to fight. Within months, the station had become a refuge for the desperate and the forgotten, a place where plague victims could receive treatment and refugees could find shelter, and escaped slaves could finally rest without fear. Emrys worked 18-hour days in the medical bay, his prosthetic arm clicking and whirring as he treated wounds and synthesized medicines. And Valkor circled the station in endless patrol, his presence alone enough to keep any threat at bay. Word spread quickly through the darker corners of the galaxy. There was a place now where the Empire's forgotten could go. A place where a strange healer with a broken body would treat anyone regardless of their status or their past. A place guarded by a dragon so ancient and powerful that even the boldest raiders would not dare approach. They came in trickles at first. Then in floods, a ship full of refugees from a border war arrived with 300 people crammed into space meant for 50. And Emrys found room for all of them. A colony of workers who had been classified as genetic defectives and scheduled for termination escaped their world and begged for sanctuary. And Emrys welcomed them without hesitation, children orphaned by pirate raids, families torn apart by the Empire's endless wars, scientists whose research had been deemed too dangerous, artists whose work had offended the wrong noble. All of them found their way to the sanctuary High Commander Desix watched this development with growing disgust from her palace on the capital world. She was the most decorated military officer in the Empire, a woman who had conquered 17 star systems and crushed rebellions on 100 worlds. And she saw Emrys Vane as an insult to everything she represented. He wastes the dragon on charity, she declared to the Council of Riders, her voice sharp with contempt. While our enemies grow bold at our borders, while rebellions fester in the outer systems, while the Empire faces threats that require strength to overcome. Some council members nodded in agreement, but others exchanged uncertain glances, because something strange was happening at the sanctuary. The refugees that Emrys saved were not simply surviving. They were thriving in ways that no one had expected. A former slave named Kira, who had arrived at the sanctuary half dead from starvation, had turned out to be a genius engineer. And within 6 months, she had designed improvements to the station's power systems that the Empire's best scientists had never considered. A group of orphan children that Emrys had personally nursed back to health had grown into brilliant young minds, and they studied medicine and engineering, and art with a passion that their teachers had never seen before. The colony of genetic defectives that the Empire had wanted to kill had included researchers who specialized in plague biology and working in the sanctuaries, modest laboratories they had developed a cure for the very genetic plague that had devastated Emrys's homeworld, a cure that the Empire's advanced medical facilities had failed to find for decades. And every single one of these people remembered who had saved them. They remembered the gentle healer with the clicking prosthetic arm who had treated their wounds without judgment, who had worked through the night to save their children, who had stood between them and death with nothing but kindness as his weapon. The loyalty they felt was not the loyalty of soldiers to a commander. It was something deeper and more personal. The loyalty of people who had been given a second chance by someone who expected nothing in return. 3 years after the sanctuary's founding, a Vorax raiding fleet emerged from hyperspace with the intention of destroying it. The Vorax were insectoid aliens known for their cruelty, slavers and pirates who had plagued the border regions for centuries, and their fleet commander believed that the sanctuary would be easy prey after all. It was defended by only one dragon and a crippled healer. The fleet commander had badly miscalculated. When the Vorax ships approached the sanctuary, they found 300 former refugees waiting for them, men and women who had armed themselves with weapons they had built in the sanctuary's workshops, who had trained in combat techniques they had learned from veterans who had found shelter there, former slaves who had sworn never to be taken again, former soldiers who had been abandoned by the Empire, but not by Emrys Vane, former children who had grown into Warriors because the man who saved their lives was threatened. And behind them all stood Velkor, the Undying, his scales gleaming like black mirrors, his ancient fire burning hot enough to melt starship hulls. The battle was over in minutes. Velkor's flame reduced half the Varak's fleet to ash, and the defenders of the sanctuary destroyed the rest. With a ferocity that stunned the surviving raiders, 3 ships managed to flee, and their crews spread the word across every criminal haven in the quadrant. Do not touch what the weak one protects. That was what they called him now. The weak one, and they meant it as a term of respect rather than mockery, because the weak one had something that no warlord or conqueror possessed. He had an army of the grateful, people who would fight and die for him, not because he commanded them, but because he had first fought and nearly died for them. High Commander Desix heard the reports and felt her fury grow. The sanctuary was becoming more than a refuge. It was becoming a symbol, proof that there was another way to build power besides conquest and fear. People across the empire were beginning to whisper that maybe strength was not the only thing that mattered. That maybe compassion had a power of its own. Desix knew that if this idea spread, it would undermine everything the empire stood for, everything she had dedicated her life to building. She began to plan if the weak one would not fight like a proper dragon rider, then she would force him to. And if he could not be forced, then he would have to be destroyed. The empire had no room for weakness. The empire had no room for a crippled healer who thought that saving lives was more important than taking them. But Desix did not understand what she was truly facing. She did not understand that Emrys Vane had already planted seeds across the galaxy, seeds of loyalty and gratitude that would one day grow into something unstoppable. She did not understand that by threatening the sanctuary she would unite those seeds into a force that even her mighty armies could not defeat. And she certainly did not understand that Velkor had chosen Emrys precisely because the ancient dragon knew what was coming. Change, revolution, the beginning of the end of everything the empire had been, and the birth of something new. High Commander Desix stood before a gathering of the empire's most powerful figures in a chamber hidden deep beneath the capital's military fortress. The room was filled with generals and admirals and nobles who shared her vision of what the empire should be. Warriors who believed that strength and conquest were the only paths to greatness. Leaders who saw Emrys Vane and his sanctuary as a disease that needed to be cut out before it spread any further. The weak one grows stronger every day, Desix said, her voice cold and sharp as a blade, and not through military might, but through something far more dangerous. She activated a holographic display that showed the sanctuary network, now expanded to 7 stations across the border regions. He has created a cult of personality, an army of the grateful who worship him for his kindness. And every refugee he saves becomes another soldier in his cause, even if they never lift a weapon. Admiral Vaughn, a massive man with cybernetic enhancements covering half his face, leaned forward with interest. Then we destroy the sanctuary and scatter his followers, he said. A simple military operation. No, Desix replied. That would make him a martyr. And martyrs are more dangerous than living men. We need something more subtle. Something that will break him completely. A thin smile crossed her face. The weak one's greatest strength is his compassion, his inability to abandon those he is sworn to protect. So we will use that compassion against him. The plan was elegant in its cruelty, while Emrys was away from the sanctuary attending a diplomatic summit on the neutral world of Kethros. Assassins would strike his most populated station, the one that housed nearly 1,000 refugees, including hundreds of children. They would not attack the adults or the armed defenders. They would target the children specifically, the ones that Emrys had personally saved, the ones whose faces he knew and whose names he remembered. and then they would leave evidence pointing to a Varax remnant fleet. Covering their tracks completely, the attack came at dawn station time. Emrys was 3 star systems away when he felt Velkor's roar of anguish through their bond. A psychic scream that nearly drove him to his knees. "What is it?" he demanded through their connection. "What has happened?" The images that flooded into his mind were almost too terrible to process. Fire and destruction, and small bodies lying still in corridors that should have been filled with laughter. Defenders who had arrived too late standing helpless among the ruins. Survivors weeping over children they had failed to protect. 47 dead. 31 of them children. Emrys commandeered a ship and pushed its engines beyond their limits, arriving at the sanctuary 6 hours later to find exactly what Desix had intended him to find: devastation. The Empire waited for his response with anticipation. Surely now the weak one would rage. Surely now he would abandon his peaceful ways and strike back with all the fury of an ancient dragon. And when he did, they would have the excuse they needed to brand him a traitor and destroy him. But Emrys did not rage. He walked through the ruins of the station with silent tears streaming down his face. And he knelt beside each small body and whispered their names. Names he had memorized on long nights in the medical bay when he had fought to keep them alive. He attended the memorial service and spoke about each child as an individual, remembering their dreams and their laughter, and the small moments of joy they had brought to the sanctuary. And then he did something that no one expected. He went to the station's communication center and broadcast a message across every channel in the quadrant. A message that reached military installations and civilian worlds and criminal havens alike. His face appeared on a billion screens, pale and exhausted and marked by grief, but utterly calm. "I know who did this," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady. "I know it was not the Varax. I know it was someone within our own empire. Someone who believes that killing children is an acceptable price for maintaining their vision of strength." He paused and took a breath. And I want everyone listening to ask themselves a simple question. What kind of empire murders children to prove its power? What kind of strength needs to destroy the helpless to feel valid? What kind of leaders would sacrifice the innocent to eliminate a crippled healer who only wanted to save lives? Desix watched the broadcast with growing unease. This was not the broken man she had expected to see. This was something else entirely. Something she had not planned for. "I am not a warrior," Emrys continued. "I cannot defeat those who did this in combat. I cannot match their military might. I cannot threaten them with fire and destruction the way they have threatened me." His eyes, red from weeping, stared directly into the camera. "But I can do something else. I can rebuild. I can save more people. I can prove that compassion is stronger than cruelty. I can show the galaxy that every life I protect is a victory against those who believe that might makes right." He leaned closer to the camera. "They killed 47 people to break me. And instead they have reminded me why I do this. Because there will always be those who prey on the weak. There will always be those who believe that power justifies any atrocity. And as long as there are people like that, there will need to be people like me. People who stand in the gap and protect those who cannot protect themselves." The message ended and silence fell across the quadrant. Then the responses began to arrive. 43 starship captains from Thesix's own fleet transmitted their resignations and their intentions to join the Sanctuary's defense force. Veterans who had spent their lives following orders but could not stomach the murder of children. 12 Dragon Riders, including 2 members of the Council itself, publicly denounced the attack and demanded an investigation. Breaking ranks with their fellow warriors for the first time in generations and across the Empire. On 1,000 worlds, ordinary citizens began to display a new symbol, a broken wing. Carefully mended, the mark of the weak one. It appeared on clothing and jewelry and the hulls of ships. scratched into walls and painted on buildings. A quiet declaration that said more than any speech could express. We stand with the healer. We stand with compassion. We stand against those who murder children. Essex realized too late that she had made a catastrophic error. She had thought that attacking Emrys's people would destroy him, but instead she had given him something far more powerful than any army. She had given him moral authority. She had proven to the entire galaxy that the Empire's leaders were willing to kill innocents to maintain their power. And in doing so, she had validated everything Emrys represented. The conspiracy had not broken the weak one. It had made him into a symbol that could never be destroyed. And now Essex faced a choice: retreat in hope that her involvement was never discovered, or double down and try to eliminate Emrys before his movement grew beyond her ability to control. She chose to double down. She would regret that choice for the rest of her very short life. High Commander Essex stood before the Imperial Senate and made her declaration: Emrys Vane is a traitor to the Empire. She announced, her voice ringing through the ancient chamber. He has corrupted the sacred dragon bond. He has turned citizens against their rightful leaders. And he has built a private army on our borders that threatens the stability of everything we have built. She raised her hand and pointed at the holographic image of the sanctuary, floating above the chamber floor. I have been authorized by the Council of Military Affairs to eliminate this threat, and I will lead the expedition personally. 300 warships gathered at the staging point near Thesix's home system, the largest military force assembled in a generation, crewed by soldiers who had been told that they were defending the Empire against a dangerous rebel. But even as the fleet prepared to launch, cracks were beginning to show. Captain Yenna, a veteran of 30 years of service, stared at her orders and felt sick. She had been assigned to the fleet that would destroy the sanctuary, the place where her own sister had found refuge after escaping an abusive noble, the place where that sister's children were growing up safe and happy for the first time in their lives when her ship launched with the rest of the fleet. Its navigation computer had somehow been programmed with a destination 3 light years away from the actual target. Yenna never found out who had changed the coordinates, but she suspected it was the young ensign whose mother Emrys had saved from a plague outbreak 4 years earlier. Similar problems plagued the entire expedition. Supply ships arrived empty, their cargo mysteriously transferred to Sanctuary. Stations along the way, fuel reserves were contaminated with impurities that forced ships to drop out of hyperspace for repairs. Communication systems failed at critical moments, leaving entire squadrons without orders, and everywhere there were small acts of defiance. Mechanics who forgot to repair essential systems, officers who misplaced crucial documents, soldiers who suddenly developed illnesses that kept them from combat duty. The network of refugees that Emrys had saved over the years had grown into something vast and invisible. Ordinary people in ordinary positions who had never forgotten the healer who had given them a second chance at life. They could not stop Thesix's fleet entirely, but they could slow it, weaken it, bleed it of resources and morale before it ever reached the sanctuary. And they did. By the time Thesix's diminished fleet finally arrived at the primary sanctuary station, 2 months behind schedule and at half its original strength, they found something unexpected waiting for them: dragons. Not just Velcor, but 17 others. Ancient beings who had abandoned their riders and flown across the galaxy to join the sanctuaries. Defense Thesix stared at the view screen in disbelief as her tactical officer reported what she was seeing. High Commander, the dragons are refusing to fight for us. They are refusing to engage the enemy. They are just standing there, on the surface of the sanctuary station. Velcor addressed his kin through the neural network that connected all bonded dragons. For too long we have allowed ourselves to be weapons, he said. We have burned and destroyed at the command of those who sought only power. We have told ourselves that strength was our purpose and conquest was our destiny. His ancient eyes swept across the gathered dragons, beings nearly as old as himself, who had come to witness what was happening. But I have learned something in my years with the human Emrys, something that I had forgotten over the millennia of war and bloodshed. He lowered his great head toward the frail figure standing at his side, the crippled healer who had changed everything. I have learned that true strength is not measured by what you can destroy, but by what you choose to protect. And this human, this weak and broken creature, whose body fails him more every year, has protected more lives than any warrior I have ever known. Dragon after dragon withdrew from Thesix's fleet, their riders screaming protests that went unheard, their bonds straining but not breaking, as the ancient beings simply refused to participate in the destruction of everything Emrys represented. And it was not just the dragons. On Thesix's flagship, crews began to mutiny. They were not rebels or traitors. They were ordinary soldiers who had heard the stories, who knew someone whose life had been saved by the sanctuary, who could not bring themselves to fire on children and refugees, and a healer whose only crime was compassion. Captain after captain reported the same thing. Their crews would not fight. Thesix raged and threatened and executed officers for insubordination, but it made no difference, because the rot had spread too deep and too wide. And then the final blow fell. 10,000 people stood on the hull of the sanctuary station, protected by emergency force fields, facing the approaching fleet with nothing but their presence. They were refugees and former slaves and orphans who had grown to adulthood. Engineers and doctors and teachers and artists. All the lives that Emrys had saved over the years of his work. They carried no weapons. They made no threats. They simply stood there. 10,000 people who had chosen to die beside the man who had given them their lives back. 10,000 witnesses to what the Empire was about to become if it fired on them. And among them, at the very front, stood Emrys Vane. His prosthetic arm had been upgraded many times over the years, but his body had continued to fail. And now he walked with a cane and moved slowly. And anyone could see that he was not long for this world. But his eyes were clear, and his voice was strong as Valkor broadcast his words to every ship in Thesix's fleet. "I am not going to fight you," he said. "I cannot fight you. I have never been able to fight anyone. All I have ever been able to do is protect people and heal people and try to give them a chance at a better life." He gestured at the thousands standing behind him. "These are the people your empire threw away. The refugees and the cripples and the genetic defectives and the orphans. The ones who were not strong enough to matter. The ones who were supposed to die forgotten in the dark corners of the galaxy." His voice softened, but they did not die. They lived because someone believed they deserved to live. And now they are doctors and engineers and parents and teachers. And they have built more than any army could ever destroy. He looked directly at Thesix's flagship, knowing she was watching. "So here is my question to you. High Commander, is this really what you want? Do you really want to kill 10,000 unarmed people to prove that strength is all that matters? Do you really want to prove to the galaxy that the Empire is nothing more than a machine for murder?" Thesix gave the order to fire. Her weapons officers refused, one by one. Ship by ship, the fleet fell apart around her as crews chose compassion over obedience. As soldiers decided that some orders were not worth following. As an entire military force dissolved not through combat, but through conscience. Thesix fled in her personal shuttle, abandoned by everyone who had sworn to serve her. A grand crusade against weakness ending in the ultimate humiliation. She died 3 days later when her shuttle was intercepted by former slaves who recognized her face from wanted posters circulating through the border regions. No one mourned her. And on the sanctuary station, 10,000 people who had expected to die embraced each other in relief and joy. While above them, an ancient dragon spread his wings and roared in triumph. The war was over. Compassion had won. 20 years had passed since the war that never was. 20 years since an empire built on strength had crumbled before an army of the compassionate. 20 years since everything had changed. The Galactic Empire of Calthrix still existed, but it would have been unrecognizable to the warriors who had ruled it for millennia. The vain reforms had transformed every aspect of society, not through force or decree, but through the slow, steady pressure of a new philosophy spreading from world to world. Strength was still valued, but the definition of strength had changed. The old ways had measured power by how many enemies you could destroy, how many worlds you could conquer, how much fear you could inspire in those beneath you. The new ways measured something different. How many lives had you saved? How many people had you lifted up? How many of the forgotten and abandoned had you given a second chance? Dragon riders no longer competed for military glory. Instead, they competed for the honor of guarding the Empire's most vulnerable populations, protecting refugee stations and plague colonies and orphanages with the same ferocity that their ancestors had brought to conquest. The bond between dragon and rider had become a sacred trust, a promise to use power in service of protection rather than destruction. And dragons, who had spent millennia as weapons of war, had found a new purpose as guardians of the helpless. And at the center of it all, in the great council chamber where the leaders of this new empire gathered to debate and decide, stood a frail old man with gray hair and a prosthetic arm that had been upgraded so many times it was now more art than machine. Emrys Vane was 73 years old, and his body had never stopped failing him. The genetic plague that had ravaged him on Sereth 7 had left damage that even the best medicine could not fully repair. And now he moved slowly and carefully, dependent on machines to keep his organs functioning, knowing that every day might be his last, but his mind was clear and his spirit was unbroken. And when he spoke, the entire council fell silent to listen. "I never wanted to change the empire," he said, his voice soft but amplified by the chamber systems so that everyone could hear. "I only wanted to save people. I only wanted to protect the ones who could not protect themselves." He smiled, the same gentle smile he had worn while carrying children through the burning ruins of Sareth 760 years earlier. But it turns out that when you save enough people, when you protect enough of the forgotten and the weak, something happens. They remember, they grow strong themselves, and they build something new from the foundation of that memory. He gestured at the gathered representatives, hundreds of beings from across the empire who had come to honor him on this day, and what a gathering it was. Former refugees who now governed entire star systems, once crippled soldiers who had become generals of a peacekeeping force, survivors of plagues and disasters and wars who had transformed their trauma into purpose, all of them wearing the symbol of the mended wing, all of them carrying the legacy of a healer who had refused to let anyone be forgotten. "Look at what you have built," Emrys said, and pride and wonder mingled in his voice. "Look at what happens when compassion becomes the foundation of civilization instead of an afterthought." He paused, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of everything he had learned in a lifetime of service. Humanity has always understood a truth that the old empire tried to deny. We know that the measure of strength is not what you can destroy, but what you can protect when everything is trying to destroy you. His eyes swept across the chamber. The universe will always send more enemies, more plagues, more disasters, more reasons to despair. But if we protect each other, if we refuse to abandon the weak and the forgotten, if we make compassion our sword and shield, his voice strengthened, drawing on reserves that should have been empty decades ago, then we are unbreakable. Beside him, Velkor the Undying lowered his massive head, his scales still black as the void. his eyes still burning with ancient fire that had witnessed the rise and fall of 100 civilizations. The dragon spoke, and his voice echoed not just through the chamber, but through the neural network that connected every bonded dragon across the stars, carrying his words to beings on 1,000 worlds. "I am 10,000 years old," Velcor said. "I have seen empires rise and fall. I have watched species ascend to greatness and descend into extinction. I have witnessed wonders and horrors beyond the imagination of mortals." His great eye focused on the frail human standing beside him, the broken healer who had changed everything. And in all that time, in all those millennia of observation and experience, I have never found a species like humanity. The chamber was utterly silent as the ancient dragon continued. "Humans are fragile. Your bodies fail you. Your lives are brief candles flickering in an infinite darkness. You possess no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities that would make you stand out among the galaxy's countless species." A sound that might have been a chuckle rumbled through the dragon's chest. "And yet you are the most remarkable beings I have ever encountered. Because give a human something to protect, and they become immovable. Give them someone to save, and they become infinite." Velcor raised his head and spread his wings, casting shadows across the entire chamber. "I chose the weakest human I could find. A crippled healer who could not even lift a weapon. A dying man whose body was failing him even as his spirit burned bright." The dragon's voice softened with something that sounded almost like love, and he taught an empire what true strength means. Emrys reached up with his prosthetic hand and touched the scales of his dragon's lowered head, a gesture of affection that had become familiar over decades of partnership. "We did it together," he said quietly. "All of us, every refugee who refused to give up hope, every soldier who chose conscience over orders, every dragon who remembered that protection is more noble than destruction." He looked out at the gathered representatives one last time. "I am dying," he said. And there was no fear in his voice, only peace. "My body has finally run out of ways to keep going, and soon I will join all the people I could not save over the years." Tears appeared in many eyes throughout the chamber. But Emrys held up his hand. "Do not mourn me. Celebrate what we have built together. Continue what we have started. And remember the lesson that a crippled healer and an ancient dragon learned together." His voice rang out one final time, carrying the wisdom of a lifetime spent in service to others. "The galaxy is full of darkness and danger, and those who would prey upon the weak. But as long as there are people willing to stand in the gap, willing to sacrifice for those who cannot sacrifice for themselves, willing to protect the forgotten and lift up the fallen, then there is hope." He smiled his gentle smile. "Be that hope for someone. Save one life, and you save a universe. Protect one child, and you change the future. Show compassion to one stranger, and you prove that humanity deserves to survive." Emrys Vane died 3 days later, peacefully, surrounded by thousands who had come to pay their respects to the man who had saved them. His last words were to Velcor, whispered through their fading bond. "Thank you for choosing me." The dragon's response echoed through the minds of every bonded pair across the empire. "Thank you for showing me what humans can be." And in the centuries that followed, as the reformed empire spread across the galaxy, bringing protection and hope to countless worlds, one image remained at the heart of their civilization: a crippled healer standing in the shadow of an ancient dragon. Proof that humanity's greatest weapon was never its fists or its fire or its fury. It was its heart. It was always its heart.